Charles do Bronx Oliveira, UFC champion, #1 contender. He's now being considered one of the best lightweights the world has ever seen. His future's bright, but for a long time, he lived a life surrounded by darkness. Growing up in the favelas of Sao Paulo, Brazil, the struggles he's overcome to get here is ultimately what makes him the champion he is today. He's been called a quitter in the past, but he's quite literally the opposite of that. There's a reason so few people make it out of where Charles made it out of. The odds are stacked against you 1,000 to 1, yet here he is. He's the one who made it out, and you wouldn't believe some of the things he's been through to get here. Poverty, death, violence. This is the story of a kid from the favelas of Brazil, the story of a champion, the story of Charles do Bronx Oliveira. Now you guys know what to do, scroll down, hit that like button, and let's get into the story. October 17th, 1989, in a Brazilian favela called Vicente de Carvalho, Charles Oliveira was born to Antonio da Silva and Osana Oliveira. Both parents came from extreme poverty, neither of them knowing how to even read or write. But both of them worked extremely hard to try and give Charles and his brother a better life. They didn't have much, but it was just enough leverage to give Charles a chance at a better life, and he took it. His family grew up in the back of his grandparents' house, although it wasn't really a house, more like a shack, just one street down from the part of the favela, where Charles, his sibling, his parents, his grandparents, and aunt all lived together. The level of poverty in these favelas is insane. There's almost no opportunity to make money or make a living, so many people resort to crime to support their lifestyle. It's a very easy path to choose when you grow up in these areas, as it's probably the easiest way to make some money. But that lifestyle isn't forgiving. Charles's parents made it their mission to make sure that he never had to resort to that life. They would each work 2 jobs, had side hustles, collected cans and scrap metal, whatever they could do. And even with that, Charles says that his parents still struggled to put food on the table most nights. He never starved, but most nights would still go to sleep hungry. His father always made sure that they ate something, even if it meant him and his mother not eating that night. This happened all throughout his life. It was rough. Every piece of clothing that he'd wear was hand-me-downs, saying that he even walked through the favelas on New Year's in ripped flip-flops as that's all he had. Charles and his family still had it better than a lot of people in that area though, and that just goes to show the level of poverty in these places. As a young kid, he would hustle on the beaches of Guajura, the tourist city just outside his favela, selling cheese or whatever he could on the beach. While all of his classmates and people that he knew were enjoying their weekends on the beach, he would be hustling. He was one of those kids. His parents wanted to make sure that he stayed on the right path, so they'd scrape together whatever money they had to enroll the kids into sports. In his parents' eyes, sports was the ticket out of crime, out of the favela, and it worked. Charles fell in love with playing sports from the moment he started. Soccer was his favorite. It's all he wanted to do. The way that he's obsessed about MMA now is how he was about soccer or football back then. This was when he was a very young child though, and before Charles could really dive in and begin to progress in sports, he faced one of the hardest challenges of his life. When Charles was around 7 years old, he started developing severe arthritis in his ankles. It got so bad to the point that he couldn't even move his foot or stand up on his own, having to stop sports, which was his biggest joy. They got him to a hospital where he eventually ended up being hospitalized for 2 long years. Even worse, the doctors told him he'd never be able to walk again, never mind play sports or soccer, the thing that Charles loved more than anything. Even as a young child though, Charles was determined to overcome this problem, not knowing how, but some way he'd figure out a way to recover and live a normal life again. But it wasn't easy. It was one of the biggest challenges he's had to overcome even to this day. His father says watching him persevere at that time, he knew Charles was a fighter and a champion from early on. He stayed in the hospital for 2 long years, mostly by himself, as both of his parents worked long hours, so he'd spend his days alone, isolated. He was living in a nightmare, and prayed every day for something to change. Well, his prayers were answered. After 2 long years of being locked into that hospital, at 11 years old he was released back into the world. The doctors told him he had to avoid any physical activity, saying that he wouldn't be able to compete or play sports. They also said that he had to take 2 injections per week for the rest of his life. He wasn't interested in what they had to say though. He was free, and he had a lot of lost time to make up for. When he was released from the hospital, he tried getting into soccer again, against his doctor's recommendations. Even though his ankle wasn't hurting anymore, he realized he probably wouldn't be able to play professionally and started looking elsewhere to fill that void. This is where he'd stumble into jiu-jitsu. One of the family's neighbors, Paulo, was a local instructor at a jiu-jitsu gym, and everybody in their neighborhood knew about Charles and their family and about Charles's medical situation. They also knew that the family had no money, so Paulo had agreed to let Charles come and train and learn jiu-jitsu for free as part of like a social program to just, give the kids a better opportunity. Charles's family didn't have the money, but they would help fund whatever they could by selling street snacks and scrap metal, scrap cardboard, literally whatever they could do. Again, they didn't have much, but they made it work. Paulo was the one who introduced Charles to jiu-jitsu. He's the one who set him on this path that he's on today. Ultimately, he changed his and his family's life. Who knows where Charles would be right now if it wasn't for that guy. So we started training jiu-jitsu, and only 2 months after training, 4 months after being released from the hospital, he entered his first jiu-jitsu tournament. He ended up taking home first place. From that point on, it was a wrap. Charles would dedicate his life to learning and mastering the art of jiu-jitsu, excelling beyond his peers very quickly. Unfortunately, a few years later, when Charles was 14, Paulo, the man who had introduced him to jiu-jitsu, had gotten gunned down in the streets of the favela where they lived. He was devastated. But that's the way of life over there. Even if you mind your business and don't get involved with trouble, your chances at survival are not guaranteed. The murder rate in some of these favelas is up to 8 times more than that of America. Innocent bystanders become victims every day. This wasn't something new to Charles though. Growing up, he'd seen people lose their lives to violence, drugs, bad choices. It gave him even more motivation to make something of himself and get his family out of there once and for all. He saw people die, go to jail, fall victim to their environment, but he wouldn't be one of them. He never even tried smoking, drinking, drugs, crimes, anything negative he stayed away from. Instead, he focused all his energy on sports. He gave his life to it, and in return, it rewarded him. He started training under Roger Coelho, a very well-decorated jiu-jitsu black belt who won world titles and competed at the highest level throughout his life. He took him under his wing, and within a year, Charles won his first major title as a white belt in 2002. From that point on, he was obsessed. He dedicated himself to learning every technique, submission, position, and mastering the art of jiu-jitsu. It wouldn't be long before he was dominating the local circuit as a jiu-jitsu athlete. However, jiu-jitsu wasn't paying the bills. Even with first-place trophies and victories, he realized throughout his teenage years this wasn't going to get them out of poverty. He never made a single dollar from jiu-jitsu his whole life. Even with this struggle and the fact that they had nothing, no money, no food, Charles's parents always believed in him, especially his father. And instead of pushing Charles to go to school or get a regular job, they'd push him every day to train. His father would tell him all the time that one day you'll be a champion. It's gonna happen. So Charles would continue training and competing in jiu-jitsu all throughout his teenage years, winning competitions and tournaments, all the way up until he was 18. This is when everything changed. This is when he made the decision to start training MMA. Originally, his mother was against it, as at the time, MMA had a bad rap in the favelas. It was really for tough guys or street guys, and she didn't want to see her kids get hurt. Charles and his brother would convince her mother anyways, and he'd take his first fight at 18 years old. Keep in mind, up to this point, the only thing Charles had done his whole life was BJJ. No striking, no boxing, no Muay Thai, nothing. Regardless, he booked his first GP, which was like a mini tournament where he'd have 3 fights in one night. Well, he got in there and won all 3 fights, even knocking some of his opponents out. This fight earned him 3,000 Brazilian dollars, which is equal to about 600 USD, the most money he'd ever made in his life. He was blown away. After that fight, he talked to some of the top guys around at the time, and they all told him that he had talent and potential. Charles took that and ran with it, realizing that now he actually had an opportunity to put some food on the table and change his family's life for real. He took his second GP very soon after, that same month, beating another 3 guys in one night, winning another bag of cash. This one earned him 5,000 Brazilian dollars, or almost 1,000 USD. Only 1 month into his MMA career, he had 6 victories and was 7,000 real richer. Life was good. With the prize money, he brought it back to his family, although they would turn him down, saying that it was his money and that he should keep it. So with his newly earned cash, he asked his dad if he could go buy his first video game. And at 18 years old, Charles went out and bought his first Nintendo with that prize money. Life was finally starting to look up. He spent all the remaining money he had on food and supplies for the house, telling his mother not to worry and that they'd have things now. Food, possessions, a bit more of a better life. All the work that he'd been putting in for years was now paying off. From that point on, his mother and father had realized that this would be the thing that turned their lives around. MMA was going to be the thing that got them out of the favelas. After everything his parents had sacrificed, there was finally a light at the end of the tunnel. He'd come a long way from that 11-year-old boy who was told that he'd never compete athletically again. Well, not only was he competing, but he was knocking out and getting into fights with some of the baddest dudes in Brazil. It was 2007 when he made his MMA debut, and by the end of that year, he'd amassed a record of 12-0, including 6 knockouts and 5 submissions. Throughout the next couple of years, he'd move his way up the circuit in Brazil, defeating future UFC fighters, future Bellator fighters, and earning a reputation as one of Brazil's most dangerous talents. He wanted more though. He wanted to compete with the best, on the biggest platform, and to do that, he needed to go to the US. January of 2010, Oliveira was named as the 3rd best Brazilian prospect to watch, according to ShareDog, and after moving through the ranks locally, he was finally offered a chance to fight in the UFC. Now that he was an MMA fighter, he needed a nickname. It was around this time when Do Bronx was born. The nickname is pretty straightforward. It pays heritage to New York City's The Bronx, as that's kind of a nickname that they give the favelas or the hood from there. They call it the Bronx. So, like I said, it's pretty straightforward, but it paints the perfect picture of who Charles Oliveira is. A kid from the favelas. A kid who's trying to make it out. Charles Do Bronx Oliveira was born. After nearly 20 years of scraping whatever he and his family could get their hands on, he'd somehow made it to this point. He dodged the violence, the temptations, the potential crossfire, and the darkness that comes with living in the streets. Not to mention the health problems he had to overcome and everything else. Still think Charles is a quitter now? I didn't think so. Well, in 2010, he signed his first UFC contract. And after what seemed like a lifelong journey just to get here, he was about to embark on yet another one that would be just as challenging. In 2010, he made his UFC debut against Darren Elkins, winning the fight in the first 40 seconds. With the perfect entrance to the UFC to complement his perfect record, Charles was projected to be one of UFC's best up-and-coming stars. However, he wasn't fighting on a local Brazilian circuit anymore. Now, he was competing with the best strikers, boxers, wrestlers, and athletes in the world. MMA is like a puzzle, like a Rubik's Cube, right? Hand it to someone when they're brand new, it's gonna take a while for them to figure it out. He had one piece of that puzzle, jiu-jitsu. And for the next 10 years, he'd figure out how to put all the other pieces together. His next 3 fights wouldn't go as well as his first one did. He'd pick up 2 losses to Jim Miller and Donald Cerrone, as well as a no contest due to an illegal knee. Clearly his MMA game, particularly striking, was really rough around the edges. So to counteract this, he moved down to featherweight for a few years. He spent the next 5 years as a featherweight trying to round off his game, his striking, where he had a pretty good but inconsistent run. He picked up a string of victories and a bunch of bonus awards, but also took losses to people like Frankie Edgar, Cub Swanson, and Max Holloway. Notice how all of these losses are against elite strikers, and that's the missing piece in Charles' MMA puzzle. Towards the end of his run as a featherweight, he was having a lot of issues making weight, and a bunch of his fights ended up being at catchweight, and most of those fights he ended up losing. So clearly he was struggling to make 145, and it just wasn't the right fit anymore. So in 2017, he moved back up to 155. Moving back up to 155 was another piece of the puzzle that he was missing. He had almost all the pieces now, but he was still missing something. His first fight at 155 went well and he won, but that momentum would stop as he took a TKO loss via elbows to the head from Paul Felder in his second fight. That loss was what triggered him to find that one last piece. Looking back, it was the biggest turning point in his career. After that loss, something had finally clicked that made him switch gyms. At that point, he'd been training at his original gym his whole life. Problem is, it was a jiu-jitsu oriented gym where he was already very high leveled. His striking was the problem. So in 2018, he joined Chute Box Diego Lima, a high-level gym that produces well-rounded elite fighters. People like Anderson Silva, Chris Cyborg are among some of the athletes who've trained there. He'd also bring his jiu-jitsu coach along as well, but incorporated that only as a complement to his new training style. And just like that, Charles had found the missing piece. That change is seemingly the key that unlocked the rest of his career. From that point on, Charles will go on a winning streak that's still going on to this day. One that's on the verge of being record-breaking, and one that could make him one of the best lightweights ever. In the next 4 years, he'd go on a 12-fight win streak, picking up a handful of bonuses, as well as UFC records. In 2019, he broke the record for most submissions in the UFC ever. He has the most finishes in the UFC ever, and he has the most bonuses in the UFC. And in 2021, he became the vacant lightweight champion of the world. At many times in his life and career, he was counted out, but through sheer hard work and self-belief, he made it to the top of the biggest fight organization in the world. He put an end to the hype train and #1 contender that was Dustin Poirier at the time. He also obliterated Justin Gaethje in the first round, something that no one has ever done before, not even Khabib. Every time he steps into the octagon, he seems to just get better. Every time, he seems to prove exactly why he's a champion. He came from nothing, literally from the streets. Still think he's a quitter? His name is Charles Oliveira, and he's the UFC lightweight champion of the world. And this has been his story.